This video will be a direct response to a video I released more than 3 years ago called Could the Division Story Actually Happen? Call it bad timing or perhaps very good timing on my part, but I put this video out only weeks before all the events that followed throughout the next couple of years. This will be a little different to my usual style of video. If you are someone who would prefer to keep that clear separation between video games and real life, you may want to click off now. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing what the comment section has in store for me. If you haven't seen the video, it was a lot of fun researching and putting it together, and I definitely recommend checking it out. But summing up, as part of my compulsive need to compare video games to real life, further increasing the immersion I get from them, I wanted to see if what Dr. Gordon Amherst did through creating the smallpox virus in a lab was actually possible. Long story short, it's already been done, albeit to a much smaller scale. In 2017, Canadian researchers were able to recreate an extinct pox virus using mail-order DNA. All they needed was $100,000, a virologist, and 6 months of work. Now, they actually made horsepox, a very close relative of smallpox, but this was more than likely to be for ethical reasons. What they wanted to show is that it's more than possible to create a synthetic version of smallpox or similar viruses, and that the world now just needs to find the best way of dealing with this going forward. From here, it would be surprisingly little work, for a biochemist of course, to start dicing and sequencing DNA from other viruses to reduce the incubation period and increase the mortality rate. Part of why I'm making this video is because at least 90% of the comments talked about and compared the dollar flu to, well, something I apparently still can't say on YouTube without being heavily restricted. So I'll just switch out that word for something more internet friendly. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. There are some vast differences. Most notably, the dollar flu was created with the intention of having a 90% mortality rate. And while we haven't been given any details in-game around the actual numbers, because, society's pretty screwed right now and counting bodies is of lower concern than general survival. But based on the extended literature, for example Thomas Parrott's most recent novel, Compromised, it's looking like Amherst wasn't far off achieving his goal. Super fluffy unicorn kitties, however, depending on the source, seems to sit around a 1 to 4% mortality rate. But that video wasn't just about how deadly the dollar flu was and how to create it. It was about how society would react. The Division story was very closely based on the real-world simulation, Operation Dark Winter. Summing up their findings, we as a society are drastically unprepared for such an incident to occur. But it isn't necessarily the biological attack that will bring down society, but industrial civilization itself. Before the release of the first game, Ubisoft commissioned the French company BETC to create a software tool called Collapse, the End of Society simulator. This tool would help create the scenario for the game. You are Patient Zero. All you had to do was type in your address and the simulator does the rest. The virus used in the simulator is the smallpox supervirus used in-game, with a 7-day incubation period and a mortality rate of 90%. The simulator used open source information on over 5,000 cities, on population densities, hospital and bed numbers, connections between cities and the rest of the world, as well as other real-world data. Shortly after giving your location, you'll run through the steps of what is about to play out. By day 4, you're starting to feel ill, you visit the hospital, and in turn, infect thousands of others. Day 6, the vaccines run out, supermarkets are virtually empty, and fights begin to break out over whatever's left. The government is forced to declare a state of emergency. Day 9, over 2 million are now infected, and the death toll is over 400,000. Law enforcement can no longer contain the riots. Martial law is declared in major cities. By day 22, 500 million people have died, with 1.4 billion infected. Energy infrastructure, communication systems, and supply chains fail. Military chains of command begin to break down. By day 24, the world as we know it has collapsed. In 2006, the US Department of Homeland Security issued a guide on pandemic preparedness, which warned of the mounting risk of a worldwide influenza pandemic and how it possesses numerous potentially devastating consequences for critical infrastructure in the United States. The pandemic will likely reduce dramatically the number of available workers in all sectors and significantly disrupt the movement of people and goods, which will threaten essential services and operations. State, local, and tribal jurisdictions will be overwhelmed and unable to provide or ensure the provision of essential commodities and services. It goes on to state that a pandemic could also cause significant economic and security ramifications, potentially including large-scale social unrest due to fear of infections or concerns about safety. Other consequences are likely to include international military conflict, increased terrorist activity, internal unrest, political and/or economic collapse, humanitarian crisis, and dramatic social change. So what does this have to do with super fluffy unicorn kitties? Well, this is where the last few years have given us more to reflect on. While this pandemic was certainly not to the same caliber of the dollar flu, there are a number of similarities in how we, as a society, reacted to it. Before anything was even really known about it, there was widespread panic. I'm sure that everyone remembers the potential toilet paper drought, where people were buying enough toilet paper to last them upwards of 10 years, only furthering the concern for others, who would in turn increase their basket spend, again, adding to the problem. Now, this is a fairly basic and relatively unimportant example in the long run, but it shows the effect of what a small amount of panic can cascade into. There are other, more depressing examples of medications running low due to panic stockpiling, where sufferers of things like asthma were struggling to get a hold of the drugs they needed. Although there are many, many other examples I could give, even just from the very small country I live in, it paints a pretty clear picture of how we would have handled things if it was a much more dangerous virus. Again, we're talking relatively early on here, without knowing the full extent of what it was capable of. But regardless, protests, demonstrations, and strikes followed around the world against responses to the pandemic by governmental bodies. Some were driven by financial hardship resulting from government measures to contain the virus, as well as restrictions on travel and entertainment. Protests have also occurred in opposition to the restrictions on people's movements, compulsory wearing of face masks, lockdowns, vaccinations, and other measures. Some protests were driven by misinformation, conspiracy theories, far-right and other extremist groups and individuals. In order to prevent the spread, governments brought in health measures at varying levels of strictness to restrict the movement of people and transmission of the virus. In response to these restrictions, protests have been organised around the world. Some protests have criticised governments for not acting effectively enough, while others have opposed the preventative measures. According to analysis, as part of the Global Peace Index, as of July 2021, there have been around 50,000 protests linked to the pandemic worldwide, with 5,000 that turned violent. These protests would of course become super spreader events, and with hospitals already running at maximum capacity, this would only further feed into the problem. Uncertainty about the future and the feeling of lack of control led to a growing belief in conspiracy theories, such as that super fluffy unicorn kitties is a hoax and that governments have deliberately created the virus. Anti-vaxxer beliefs, including that vaccinations and restrictions on citizens' movement are a part of a governmental plot to control people, and that Bill Gates is behind implanting microchips into people via vaccinations. Naturally, it needs to be mentioned that a number of these misinformation protests have been driven by organisers with the intention of making money. In saying that, if there was a much higher mortality rate, communication services would begin to fail, and without the internet, the misinformation wouldn't have been able to spread so far and wide at such a rapid pace. So I went a little off track here. What does this have to do with the division story? Well, honestly, everything, when comparing the response to how everything played out with the dollar flu. I see it as the precursor to what could come. This was our test virus. The developed world is only growing, with city centres becoming more and more densely populated. History has taught us that it's only a matter of time before something like this happens again, potentially something far more deadly than we've seen in our lifetime. So if super fluffy unicorn kitties was a practice virus, how prepared do you think we are? If people were dying in droves, do you think we'd still have all the riots, evading of rules, and conspiracy theories? And I really need to mention the sanitation workers. They've been there on the front lines cleaning and sterilising infected areas. If the next pandemic escalates to a level we aren't prepared for, how long before they band together and start burning down whole neighbourhoods? Anyway, I think I'm going to go restock my emergency kits. I'm not a prepper at all, but maybe those guys are onto something. Thanks for watching, and Extremis Malus, Extrema Remedia.